Welcome to Lesson 19 in the C# from Start to Finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today is finally the day. Today we finish off the Create Tournament form. This one has been a big one. It has a lot of moving parts, which can get overwhelming, but so far we've broken it down into manageable bits. Today is going to be no different. We will take on the last bits of logic needed to save this data to the database or text file, and we're done. So let's get this lesson started. By way of review, we've been doing all of our work underneath this button, or at least triggered by this button. So inside here, we have validated the data, and now we have said, create the rounds. That's what we did this last time. And what that did is it filled up our object to have those rounds in there with who's going to play in each round. And now today, we're going to work on this Create Tournament. If you remember back 2 lessons ago, we created the Create Tournament where we actually saved stuff to the database, but we didn't have the round information to save yet. So we're going to do that now. So let's actually follow this right to the SQL location. So SQL connector, we're looking for the Create Tournament. Create Tournament right here. And if you notice, we have Save Tournament. Remember, that's the first thing we do because we have to have a tournament ID for the other saves. Then we have Save Prizes and Save Entries. So now all we need to do is look at the rounds themselves and create a Save Tournament Rounds. And we'll follow the same pattern. Patterns are good. Now let's actually come down here to our Save Tournament Entries. We'll copy this text here so we have that same value. And we'll just write down below, we'll say private void, paste in that text, IDB connection, and tournament model. Not logic, model, called model. All right, so here is the code, or at least the code section, where we need to save our round information. Now this is going to be a little bit more complex than with the entries up here, because this is just looping through a list of teams. That's all it's doing. But down here in the saved rounds, remember that we have, and let's look at it over here in our tournament model, we have this. So we have to save a list of matchup model. To make things a little more complex, inside matchup model, we have a list of matchup entry model called entries. So we're going to have to save those as well. To make things a little more complex, and complexity at this point is okay. Don't get overly concerned about complexity because we haven't yet figured out how to deal with this yet or even started to worry about it. We're just trying to get a handle on what's going on. So to make things a little more complex, we have to save this in order. And the reason we do is because we cannot save a matchup entry model until we have the idea of its matchup. And we can't save round 2 information until round 1 is saved, because in round 2 matchup entry models, you'll see that we have the matchup model of the parent. Well, that's going to save in the database as an ID. Well, how do we store an ID of something we don't know about yet? So therefore, we have to make sure we have those IDs. The cool thing here, though, is if we do save this in order and save the first list of matchup model and get the IDs and repopulate those models, the next round will already have the IDs it needs, because this matchup model parent matchup refers to the previous round's model. And again, it's using that idea that we're not copying values for instances. we are just pointing to the same address. So if we update the information at an address, everybody else that has that same address can still access it. So we'll have the ID by that point to save this next round. And then when we go to round 3, if there is one, we'll have the IDs from round 2 because, again, we've stored those. So we'll have all the information we need. The key is to make sure that we have this information in order. So we can't do certain things out of order. So we have to have that order in place. But besides that, it's actually a pretty straightforward process. The only other thing we need to do, if you notice, matchup entry model does not have an ID, but matchup model does. So let's copy this ID field and put it into matchup entry model, because we're going to need that. Maybe not right now, but we'll definitely need that. So we have to make sure we have that on all of our models, but right now we're working with matchup entry model, and I believe that's the last one that does not have an ID. So we'll make sure that's at least on there. Okay, so let's start breaking down this logic into steps. And again, don't try and tackle the whole thing all at once. We really are doing the equivalent of eating an elephant here. If you've ever heard that idea or that concept before, but the concept is you can eat an elephant if you take it one bite at a time. And that's what we're going to do here is this form is pretty formidable as far as the amount of logic it has. But when you break it all down, it's just bits that we already know and putting them together. We have all the tools we need. So let's list out the steps we need to take. And I think that you'll see that every step is pretty simple on its own, and combined, it's pretty powerful. So the first thing we need to do is we're going to need to loop through the rounds. Now that loop is a little interesting in that it's a list of matchup model. So when we loop through it, the resulting value, the one value, will be a list, not an individual item. And so when we loop through the rounds, then we're going to need to, inside that, we're going to need to loop through the matchups. And that loop will give us each individual matchup. And inside those matchups, we're going to need to save the matchup. And then we're going to need to loop through the entries and save them. So loop through the rounds. Inside each iteration, loop through the matchups. Inside each iteration of that, save the individual matchup, and then loop through the entries in that matchup and save them as well. And then we should be done. So let's make sure that we have this logic right by starting out and just trying it and seeing if we've missed any parts. But I don't think we've missed any parts. So let's go do a for each. And we're going to say list of matchup model. And we're going to call this round in model.rounds. So each individual item is a list of matchup model, and that represents one round. Now, according to our schedule here, that's done. We need to now loop through the matchups. So for each matchup model, and this is where not using var can be helpful, especially at first, because you have a better picture of what it's actually looping through. Especially since if you get it wrong, say I thought this was just a matchup model. Guess what? It goes, you can't do that. I can't translate each individual round to a matchup model. It's a list of matchup model. So typing it out, make sure that you know what you're doing. If I had done instead var, that would work, but I may have a misunderstanding of what this round represents. Now, if I mouse over, it says list of matchup model. But sometimes when you're first starting out especially, typing that out gives you a better idea of what's going on. Over time, you may drift to that var naming convention, and that's fine. I would just encourage you to make sure that you still think about the younger developers in your shop if you have more than one developer, and make sure that you're still writing your code in a way that's understandable to them. The best code is code that's simplistic enough for even a newer developer to understand, and yet powerful enough to get the job done. A lot of higher level developers, mid-range developers, and even senior developers think that the best code is complex code that's really efficient or really tight, and it's a lot of one-liners and things like that. And I've found that that really hasn't yet achieved the best code. The best code actually becomes simpler, not more complex. That's just my 2 cents. Take it for what it is. All right, so now we're going to do back on track here. Now we're going to do a loop on each round. And in this loop, we're going to pull out each individual matchup for that round. So now we've looped through the rounds. We've looped through the matchups. Now our next job right here is to save the matchup. And then inside of another for loop, we have to then save the entries. Now, this raises the issue of, do I just copy and paste the code from, say, here? What I would recommend is you just copy this, paste it down here, and modify it. Just make sure you modify every single line, even if you have to comment the entire thing out, like so, and then uncomment every line as you modify it. So it's just something you could do to make things a little easier. Now, I want you to notice too, we already have our connection. Don't forget that way back up here, we started our using statement. So we're still covered inside that using statement. And we're using the same connection for all of this. We're only opening one connection, which is great. It's very, very efficient. So we need to actually save a matchup to the database. And I'm pretty sure we don't have that stored procedure yet. So let's go to the database. And we have matchups get, but not a matchups insert. So let's first of all expand out our matchups table so we have the columns we have to insert. And we'll create a new procedure. And you should be getting used to this process by now. Again, if you're still struggling with SQL, I do have a course on that walks you through all the way through understanding store procedures and building databases. That might be helpful if you're still struggling. All right, SP matchups underscore insert. Again, following that pattern. SP prizes underscore insert. SP teams underscore insert. Now SP matchups underscore insert. And we have the @tournament ID. That's an int. We have the @winner ID. That's an int. And we have the @matchup round as an int. So we have 3 ints we're passing in: the tournament ID, the winner ID, the matchup round. And then finally, we want to have the ID int equals 0 output. And that will give us the ID back of the created record. Now, this isn't a time to just keep our head down and just start typing away. We have to think about what we're doing here. And the one thing I want to look at is this @winner_ID. Do we know who the winner is yet? No, we don't. You could theoretically say that we do know the winner of the rounds where, or matchups where we have a bye, but since there's so few and we can deal with those in other ways, I really don't want to deal with them as having an immediate win. I want to first insert everything in the database and then go back through and mark my winners, because I can use that same logic then to mark my winners again when people actually have a matchup and one person wins over the other. So I don't want to include the idea of that bye week being an automatic win yet. So we don't know the winner ID. We don't have to pass it in then. Why pass in a value that we'll never know? We are creating this record. So when you create a matchup, you'll never know who the winner is. So we're just not going to pass that in. So we have tournament ID. We know that. Matchup round. That's the round 1, round 2, round 3. We know that. And we get back the ID of the matchup. So a matchup's pretty simple. There's not a whole lot to a matchup, and that's okay. So let's create this simple insert. Insert into dbo.matchups tournament ID and matchup round, and we are going to pass in nothing for the winner ID. If you notice over here, this right here says that it's a null by default. It allows nulls, and it will be a null by default. Therefore, we can leave it alone and not put an ID in at all. So we're not even going to pass that in or put it in the insert statement. So insert into DBO matchups, just the tournament ID and the matchup round. Values at tournament ID at matchup round. And then our select at ID equals scope identity. And that's all there is to our SP matchups insert. I'll copy that. I'll execute the whole thing. I'll come over here and I will modify this to say SP matchups insert. The tournament ID is correct, but instead of team ID, it's matchup round. So I'll copy that. I will paste that in, including the @ symbol. And so now I can uncomment all of these. And we have the model.id. Well, that's the tournament ID. That's great. Then we have the matchup round. And that's not right. So we say item. Let's name it something besides item. That's not. Let's call it matchup. So matchup dot the round number. Matchup round. And the ID gets passed back out. So let's grab the ID. In order to do that, I'm going to scroll up here to this method where I know that I have gotten that ID back out. There's no reason to memorize code. Just remember where it is. Remember the patterns you use. And so now instead of model.id, we don't want to do that because that would override our tournament model ID. That's not right. Instead, that's not in the right spot. It's down here. There we go. Instead of model.id, we're going to say matchup.id. So this is the ID for the particular matchup. So we've looped through the rounds. We've looped through the matchups. We've saved each matchup. And if we left this alone right now, we have the matchups at least saved in the database. But before we do the next iteration of this for each loop, we have to do yet another nested loop for each. And this will be matchup entry model entry in matchup dot entries. So this will loop through every entry we have, and now we have to save the entries. So again, I will copy this, and I'll paste it in. And again, I'm going to comment it out for now. And the reason I comment it out is I want to make sure that I don't just use this code and cause all kinds of problems. Copying and pasting is a bad thing typically, but you can make it into a good thing if you use only the pattern. And the way I do that is to comment the whole thing out and then uncomment the lines as you modify them. So in this case, we're going to try and save a matchup entry. We don't have a matchup entries insert. So let's open up matchup entries, look at our columns, and create a new store procedure. And what I'd encourage you to do is, we've been doing this pattern for a while now. Pause the video right here and follow along by building your own query, your own store procedure, and make sure that what you do matches up with what I'm going to do. Because by now, you should pretty much know what I'm going to do. We've done it a number of times. And if you don't worry about it. Don't get all flustered. Instead, just watch what I'm doing, do it along with me, go back and practice it again until it becomes second nature. The key to being a good programmer or a good database developer is not about how much you know necessarily. It's about how much you practice. That's really what separates a decent developer from a great developer. Practice. Once you've done it 100 times, or 1,000 times, or 10,000 times, it becomes much easier to concentrate on the logic you're trying to do and not worry about the syntax, because the syntax kind of flows. And even some of the patterns of logic flow as well. So sp matchup entries underscore insert. The parameters at matchup ID int, and that's the ID we just captured, so we know we have that. At parent matchup ID int. This is the one that in round 1 we don't have a parent matchup ID. So in this case, it's going to be null or empty for a first round. After that, we'll know what it is. And that's okay. We can pass in a null. At team competing ID int. That's the actual team, and we know who they are because remember, whenever we create a team, they get an ID immediately, and then we put them into a tournament. So we have IDs for every team in our tournament already. So we know this. And then at score, we don't need, because the score is going to be nothing to begin with because we don't know the score. They haven't played yet. Therefore, there is no score. We could set it to 0, but I like null better because null is not the same thing as 0. They're two different things. Null is the absence of a value. 0 is a very real value. For example, if you are playing soccer or football, if you're in any country outside the US, when you're playing that, you may have a game that's 1-0. 0 is the score of a losing team. It is a real value. And so 0 holds significance in that context. So even just putting a 0 here doesn't really make sense. Doesn't make me feel comfortable because that might be a value and it might not, where null is the absence of a value. And they may also say, well, I could put a -1 there, and that would indicate no score yet. But that's not really true, because what if it's a golf tournament? -1 is pretty good. That's 1 under par. And that's actually a real valid value. So I leave this as null and don't touch it. Finally, id int equals 0 output. In this case, I don't think we need to capture the matchup ID, the matchup entries ID, but we'll at least have it in case we need it. Now we can do our insert statement. If at all possible, it's really helpful to match up your parameters with the field they're going into. Because then on your insert statement, you can say, this field lines up with this value, and they're identical. So it makes sense. Just visually, I can look at that and say, yep, that looks right. So that's just something to keep in mind. All right, so the scope identity. We'll execute this. And actually, this is the more proper way of saying it. If we look at our store procedures, we will see that dbo.sp matchup entries underscore insert is still a name, even though I didn't specify it up here. Even though I didn't specify it and it still worked, specify it. Make sure you have it, because this just makes your database engine work that little bit less. So it's always important to keep those included on any call. All right, so I have the new name, and now I can start uncommenting some of these lines. Now var p equals new dynamic parameter. Well, that's going to yell at me because we already have a p created. So I will just delete the var first, because we're going to use the p from this outer scope, and that's okay. We can override it because we don't need it anymore up here. Now we're using it down here to create a new set of dynamic parameters. We can't uncomment this line or this line yet. We can do this one, and we can do this one. So now let's grab our parameters. I don't trust myself to get my parameters correct every time. So I'm going to copy those, and I'm going to paste them in. I'll probably just paste them right here for now. I'll make the formatting look right. And then I will comment these out. So these are my parameters. I'll put some space here around them just so I can see them better. So I'm going to say matchup ID. I'll uncomment this. The matchup ID is going to be the matchup.id. And we just populated that right up here. So we know that's populated. So that's good. Next is the parent matchup ID. So I'll say parent matchup ID, and that is the entry dot parent matchup. Now, if we have not set that value, it will be null, which is great. That's what we want. The last thing is a team competing. So let's just copy one of these rows. Copy the first one, We'll change team competing. And we're going to say this is entry dot team competing dot ID. So the ID of the team competing. We don't pass the entire record in because we only need that identifier, because the database knows about all the teams, so it knows it can look up the team based upon its identifier. So those are 3 parameters. I can get rid of those comments now. And now we have our matchup entries insert. But wait, before we can declare victory here and say we're done, which in the general logic we are done. We've looped through the rounds, looped through the matchups, saved the matchups, and then looped through the entries and saved them. So that's all done. But before you go, make sure you check what you do with buys, because buys aren't going to be saved to the database. So let's look at our tournament logic and look at create rounds. That's not it. Create other rounds. That's not it. Create first round. Okay, so here's our logic. We're going to loop through each team and add an entry model to our matchup model. Now, if the buys is greater than 0, then do this. Add that matchup to our output and skip over doing another entry. Therefore, if you have a buy, you only have one entry in your list of matchup entry models inside of matchup model. So you follow that? In the matchup, we have a set of entries. Typically, on a quote-unquote normal matchup, you have 2 entries, Team A and Team B. But in the case of a buy, we only have 1 entry. Will that cause a problem? Well, no. We're doing a for each on the entries. If you have 1, it will loop through this once. If you have 2, it will go through it twice. Therefore, we're all set. Therefore, in theory, we have just saved all the information to the database. So save tournament rounds is now complete, which means that our logic for our form should be done for the SQL branch. So let's test it to be sure. So I'm going to come down here to program.cs, make sure that I select my SQL file, and let's run our application. And that'll load up. And first of all, it didn't crash. That's excellent. You're always happy when your application doesn't crash or say you have a bug just by starting it up. Now, before we go any further, let's go to SQL. We can close out of these procedures. I'm going to create a new query window. I'm going to grab 2 values here. I'm going to select star from dbo.matchups. And I'll do select star from dbo.matchup entries. Hit F5. There's no entries in either the matchup entries or the matchups. So we know that there's nothing there yet, which is a good thing. Let's create our first tournament and see if it works. First tourney. Let's put an entry fee of 15. I like making changes to all the values if I can the first time through, just to make sure that everything gets populated in the right place. So we have just 2 teams. First team first place and uncanny losers. So let's add both of those to our teams. But we can't do a tournament with just 2 players. I mean, we could, or 2 teams. We could, but let's do it with 3. That way we can even test the bye week. So I create a new team, and I'll call it Sue's team. And we're going to put, well, let's put Sue Storm in. And that's it for now. And Sue is now on the list. Prizes, let's just add one prize here. We'll say first place gets 100% of the income. Create prize, we called it first. Create tournament. Cross your fingers here. And it blows up. Excellent. That's okay. That just means that we haven't completed everything we need to do yet. So, it says an unhandled exception of type system.nullReference exception occurred. Object reference not set to an instance of an object. Once you've dealt with objects or class instances often enough, you're going to know this message by heart. You'll get it a lot. So, essentially what it means is that we try to use, in this case, a property of an instance that hadn't been created yet. And you can't do that. So, I'm going to close out of the dialog, but I'm not going to hit stop yet. Don't hit stop. First, look at all of your data. So I have matchup.entries. There's 2 entries, and that's good. So in this current iteration, I have 2 entries, and I'm probably looping through the first one, but I don't know for sure. But that's okay. We can look at both of them first. So I have an ID of 0 for the entry. That's okay. We don't know the ID yet. A score of 0, sure. Team competing is null. Well, that's not good. Parent matchup. Matchup round is 1, ID is 2. Did you catch that? Let's look at the matchup ID. Matchup round is 2. So we're not in the first round anymore. We're in the second round. That's the round where we don't have any teams yet, because no matchups have been played, therefore no winners have advanced to the next round. Therefore, of course, we don't have a team competing. It's null. Therefore, if the team competing is null, you can't have the ID of a null object. Therefore, we can't pass in the team competing. Now, you may say, oh no, panic. Don't panic. Just look at your SQL for a minute. Let's go look at matchup entries. We're passing in, let's go back there for a minute. We're passing into the team competing, okay? So team competing, it's this column right here. What do you notice about this column? It's nullable. This one, not null. This one and this one are both null, meaning you don't have to pass in a value. And in fact, we can't pass in a value because we don't know it yet. And this is the one tweak we made before we started saving our data or creating these rounds, because we couldn't pass in a team competing ID. But yet here, we're trying to. Now I'm going to show you a trick. What I'm going to do, I'm going to mouse over this yellow arrow right here. And when it's directly over the yellow arrow, I'm going to click and drag up one line. Notice now the yellow line is one line higher. Now, at the end of this line, I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to say if entry.teamCompeting equals null. I'm going to cut this line and paste it in here, and instead pass in just the team competing, which is null. In fact, I'll just pass in null. else pass in the ID. So you see what I did there? I put a check in place right away. The code still paused, but I put a check in place that said, hey, if the team competing is null, then pass in null for team competing ID. But if the team competing is not null, then pass in that ID. Now I come back over here to the yellow line, yellow indicator, and drag it down over the if statement. This is one of those nice things about debugging in Visual Studio. And it doesn't work in every instance. There's a few times it doesn't work. But for the most part, we have what's called edit and continue. The idea that we can, while the debugger is paused, make changes to our code and then keep running. And so in this case, I moved the yellow line off of the line that had a problem so I could move it around. But then I moved it back to what would be the next line of code. And now I can step into just to make sure this works. So let's mouse over P for a minute and make sure that it has parameters, just two, matchup ID and parent matchup ID. It does. So now if we step over, it should have a third one, which it does. And that third one is team competing ID. So now we can continue on our code. I can say F5, and it should continue on with our application. And it goes, I don't think so. All right. So it says the member parent matchup ID cannot be used as a parameter value. Okay, so the member parent matchup ID of type tracker library.models.matchup model cannot be used as a parameter value. So what is our parent matchup ID? Well, right up here, parent matchup ID, I passed in the entire parent matchup instead of dot ID. Oops. Now, the way to resolve that is to move this cursor again. But before I do, let's think this through for a minute. So far, I've been passing in the parent ID as the entire model, and it worked because remember, we are in round number 2. Therefore, we've already completed round number 1. So how did that work? Well, for the first round, the entry.parent matchup was null. And that was okay because parent matchup ID is a nullable type and we wanted to pass in null, which is kind of like what we're doing down here. So we actually need the same logic as here, only we need it for our parent matchup. So if entry.parent matchup is null, the parent matchup is null. Otherwise, the parent matchup ID is passed in. We can take this row out now. So the same logic twice. Let's just get a little bit of space in our if statements just to have a little bit of separation there, not blend them in. But here's the problem. We've already tried to execute the statement, which means that P, the parameters, is already populated with 4 parameters. What do we do? Well, what we need to do is actually drag our yellow indicator all the way to P equals new dynamic parameters. That will wipe out P. P now has 0 parameters. And now we can step down through the code and make sure we populate properly all the values. And if we look at P now, we should see that it has 4 parameters. And those parameters are as expected. We could dive even further into the values and get that, but that's good enough. Now let's continue. And now it brings us back to our form. So did it work? Well, typically our form should have some kind of feedback system where it either said, you've got a problem, or it closes out the tournament. Because just like the add team or create prize, just like the create new or create prize, when we're done, we close the form out and take the data and do something with it. In this case, I would assume that if I create a tournament, it should take me then to that tournament. So how do we know if it worked? Well, let's go to our database and run this code. So did it work? We've got values. Let's see if the values look right. First, matchups. So we have tournament ID of 1. These are all in the same tournament. That's good. No winners yet. That's fine. Matchup rounds, round 1, and round 2. We had 3 teams. So we had to add a bye. That's 4 teams. So we had 2 games the first round, and the winners of those advanced to the next round, round 2, and they play each other. And that's all we have. Therefore, 2 games in round 1, 1 game in round 2. Perfect. Now for our matchup entries. We have 5 matchup entries. Now if you do the math on that, you think, wait, we have 6 we should have, correct? Well, no. Let's see why. We have matchup ID of 1. Team competing ID is 2. Notice the random order here. It's not 1, 2, 3. That's because we randomized that order. If we do the same thing over again, it shouldn't be in the same order. But matchup ID of 1 only has team competing of 2. There is not a second matchup ID of 1 because one team had to have a bye. And it's always the first team that gets the first bye. And so this team, team ID number 2, got a bye for round 1. Next, we have 2 teams, team 1 and team 3, which are in matchup ID number 2. Then we have 2 teams in matchup ID number 3, the parent ID of which is matchup ID 1 and matchup ID 2. So this entry is the winner of matchup ID 1, which would be just team 2. And this is the winner of matchup ID 2, which is either team 1 or team 3. Therefore, we've got everything we need. There's no parent for round 1, and we don't know the teams competing for round 2 and beyond. We don't know a score for anybody. So, it looks like all the data for our tournament for SQL is going into the database. Now, I don't know about you, but having just 2 little errors, and that's it, is huge. With all that code we wrote, we only had 2 errors. That comes from breaking things down into small little pieces and following those same patterns over and over again. It also really helps to have a really good plan to work from. And when we get to a place where the plan doesn't cover, we plan first and then do it. So, this is working. The only thing we'll need to do is figure out what to do after we create this tournament. Where are we going to send it? That's not for today. That's a really simple change. Just like with our create prize, when we first created that form, we didn't go anywhere with it. And we're going to do the same thing here until we know what wants this information or what's going to happen next. So we'll close out of this. And now one thing to note that you may not catch, but I just stopped my application and I already have modified code. Notice the yellow line here and the asterisk up here. Normally you don't ever have modified code after you've run your application. Because what happens when you hit start up here, or you say debug, start debugging, or if you say hit F5, any of those tasks, when you do them, the very first step it does is save everything in your application. So how is it we can have unsaved lines of code? Well, these lines of code are the ones that I modified in line while we were debugging. And so it saved that information, which was amazing. That's great. But now I have to make sure that I actually save this data before I go any further. It's not a huge deal, and it's not something that will likely trip you up because you'll probably run this again before you close out. And even if you didn't, when you go to close out, it's going to say, do you want to save this? But I just want to point that out so you don't say, well, why do I have unsaved code here? All right, let's close out of everything else except for the right up here text connector. Because now we have to work on actually saving our text information. Now this is a bit different. Now all of our text has been a little bit different, but let's look at, I could collapse everything, but really I just need to come down here. So let's just collapse those. There is an option if you right click and say, it's in here, outline, collapse the definitions, that will collapse everything down like this. And that's very helpful for just seeing the names. You could also come up here once you're inside your class, like you've clicked inside your class, you can do this drop down and find what you're looking for, and it takes you right to it. So there's a lot of ways to navigate here. I don't always do the fastest way necessarily. It all depends on, what I'm thinking of right then. Usually it's not how to navigate the editor. Usually it's about the logic of what I'm trying to do. So in here, we have create tournament. And it goes through, it loads all the tournaments. We'll cover the convert to tournament file in a minute, or tournament models. But then down here, we add our current model, which is fine. The model you pass in has all the rounds information already, sort of. And then we save to tournament file. Now I say sort of up here because remember when we worked on a SQL connector, we had to add all those IDs in by looping through, creating it, adding the ID, and updating the models and so on and so forth, all the way through to make sure that the later rounds had the IDs of the previous rounds and all the rest. So therefore, we haven't done that yet here. So when we say save to tournament file, we've got a little bit of a problem because when we do that, the information isn't here. Now let's go to the actual save to tournament file and look at what it does. Now this one we actually completed. We have lines. Remember our pattern here where rounds looks like this? So we've done our pattern where we have the ID, the tournament name, the entry fee, the teams converted to a list of string, the prizes converted to a list of string, and the rounds converted to a list of string. And we did all that because we didn't need to worry about where it was coming from. We just knew we had a model and it had all the information. And so therefore we can convert it to this pattern based upon what we already know. But that means that over here, before we add this model, we have to populate all of those IDs with proper values. So how do we do that? Well, I think right here, we need to have a tournaments dot save rounds to file. We're going to pass in first our model, which is our tournament model. And then we'll pass in two values. The first being the matchup file, and the second being the matchup entry file. Now, I have none of this stuff. I don't have this method. I don't have this file or this file. Let's start by creating these files. Private const string matchup file equals matchup models.csv. And then private const string matchup entries file equals matchup entry models.csv. Just making sure to follow a pattern here. So now this would be matchup entry, not entries. There we go. And so now we have no red squigglies there, so those are at least right. And now we need to just create that save rounds to file. So what this method is going to do is it's going to simulate the same kind of logic we had in the SQL connector, where we looped through every round and then every matchup and saved both the matchup and the matchup entries. And once we have all that information, we'll keep populating that model, and then we can pass all that information back so that the model will be populated with all the IDs. Then we can save the information. I'm going to start by actually copying this entire line, the signature line. And before I go anywhere, I'm going to realize, wait a minute, this tournaments, that's my list of tournaments. That's not what I want. I actually want to take this out and say model dot. Now, remember up here with our tournaments, we have a list of tournaments that we've loaded from the database, and we're doing things on them based upon the fact that we can add extension methods like this one to our list of tournament model. But in this case, we're not operating on our list of tournament models. We're operating on one specific model. So we need to operate on our model. So model.saveRounds to file, we don't need to pass the model in because we're already operating on it. Create an extension method for tournament model. So I'll copy this signature line, and then I'll come over to the text connector processor, which is where all of our extension methods are. And I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to, underneath the save for one of these, I'm actually going to put my signature. Let's put it right here. Public static void. I'll paste in save rounds to file. And I will say this tournament model string matchup file string matchup file or matchup entry file. So now I've created an extension method, save rounds to file, which is going to operate on a tournament model, and we're going to pass in the matchup file and the matchup entry file. Now you may ask, why did I pick this line in particular to paste this code in and start working here? Well, I am going to do a save. I wanted to have code around this code that kind of went with save, so I could use the same patterns. The only problem is this one's a bit different than all the rest. Now, it doesn't mean we abandon our patterns. It just means that this one will use patterns from more than one location. So in this case, let's write out our logic again. So we need to loop through each round. Inside each round, we need to loop through each matchup. We need to save the matchup and get an ID. And actually, that's in reverse order. Get the ID for the new matchup and save the end record. Then we loop through each entry, get the ID, and save it. So if you notice, some of this code, like getting the ID for the new matchup and saving the record, we come back over here at text connector, we load all the tournaments, we get the ID, and we put the ID into the model, and then we call the save method. So some of this code right here will actually be in this entry over here in our save rounds to file. So we're going to have some logic from both places. So just keep that in mind. But let's start with the easy stuff. For each, this is going to be a list of matchup and matchup model. We'll call it matchups. Nope, we'll call it round. In model.rounds. Let's try and keep the same consistent naming. And we're going to do a for each matchup model matchup in round dot no dot. So just round. So for each matchup model matchup in round. So now we have where we need to save. We first need to, let's do the code comments here. Load all of the matchups from file. Get the top ID and add one. Store the ID. Save the matchup record. And then we do the same thing for our matchup entries. So let's create a couple of extension methods. I'm going to call the first one public static void save matchup to file. This matchup model called matchup, and we'll pass in the string matchup file. We should really rename these. Up here be lowercase as well. These are parameters. And then we're going to actually in here, what we'll do is we're going to call this up here. So we've got the matchup. We're going to say, oops, one line too many. We're going to say matchup dot save matchup to file and pass in our matchup file. So let's just pretend for a minute this is going to work. When we call this on this matchup, we're going to save just the matchup, not the matchup entries, just the matchup to the file. And then in here, we will call the actual save to the text file. And then we'll have another one that will loop through probably here. And we have the option. So we either loop through then the entries here and say for each, we can say matchup entry model entry in matchup dot entries, and we can say entry dot save entry to file and pass in the matchup entry file. So we could do that here, or we could do it down here after we save the matchup. It really is up to us. I kind of like the idea of doing this call inside of the matchup, because part of the matchup is who is competing in that matchup, those entries. So it seems incomplete not to save those as well when you're saving the matchup entry, or the matchup, not matchup entry. So let's actually cut this code here and paste it down here. And we'll say we're going to do some save stuff here first, and then we will loop through each entry and call that. So before we go any further, let's stub out this method as well. So let's say public static void save entry to file, this matchup entry model, entry string, and this is going to be the entry file name. So matchup entry file. And that'll work. We just don't have this file being passed in. Therefore, let's say we need to pass it in. And now up here, we have to say matchup entry file as well. So now we're passing in, this gets really simple. We are looping through each round in each matchup and one by one saving that matchup. And then inside that save, we're going to actually do a save up here. And then we're going to loop through every entry and save that entry. Inside there, we'll actually do the save of the entry. All along the way, we'll make sure we're updating our IDs, because don't forget that, especially in a text file, it's very important that everything has an ID, because that's the only way we reference it, is by that ID. So we have to do basically the pattern from here and some pattern from up here. So let's kind of get all this in one spot. Let's start with the save matchup to file. The first thing we need to do is we need to load our file. Now let's come up here and look at the files we have access to. So here would be a load of a file. So right here we say full file path, load file, that loads the string, and then convert to our tournament model. Well, we're going to do the same thing down here, but we have to have this method to call. So let's actually create that method. And I didn't copy the entire thing by accident. So let's just copy prize, it's fine. And I'll paste it down below because that's where I'm working right now. I can see it most easily here. So I'll paste it right here. And you just need to make sure that we're saving the correct information. So it's not prize model. This is going to be matchup model. So list of matchup model, convert to matchup models. Let me just spell it right. Always check your spelling. And we're going to pass in a list of string. That's great. It'll return, the output will be a list of matchup model. And so now this breaks all that, and that's okay. We need to identify, though, what a matchup model looks like. Well, let's open up matchup model real quick. And we see we have an ID, that'd be column 0. We have a list of entries. Now, what are we going to put here? And this is where having SQL can actually mess you up a bit. And here's what I mean by that. In SQL, if we look for the matchups table, we have no information about which matchup entries we have. None. But in our model for the matchup, we have this list of matchup entry. And so therefore, we do know about the entries in this matchup model. And if we go to matchup entry, we don't know about who called us, who set us up, what matchup we're in. We do know the parent we came from, but not the current matchup we're in. So it's kind of the other direction, and that can be a little bit confusing, but it's okay. We just need to know that it's a little bit different. Now, the one thing we're missing, and this is where we could have gotten tripped up very easily, is we don't have a tournament ID in this matchup model. We don't know who our matchups are. So you need to question, is that a problem? Well, let's look at how this works. If we scroll up here, we're going to see that we're actually saving all this information in relationship to this model. And we're updating the IDs at a furious pace. Every ID gets updated. And the reason why is because when we save this tournament record, we save all the information about the tournament, including all the information about the rounds. So see the rounds right here? This represents one matchup. One matchup. One matchup. And so therefore this ID will link that matchup to this tournament. And then this ID for this matchup will then link the tournament entries to the tournament, because inside the matchup will be the IDs for the tournament entries. So therefore, we're good not storing the tournament ID. And this is where you have to kind of trust the system. Trust that the system you built is right. Now, definitely trust but verify. Make sure that's what you're thinking it's going to do. And take a step back and walk through the process. Make sure you're not storing data that you can't get back out. I've actually looked at this a couple times where I'm thinking, oh no, I have a bug in my code. I don't know how that data gets out. And so I walk through it line by line and go, oh, okay, I do know how it gets out. That's how we're going to piece the data back together. So just make sure that you know that. And it is different for text files than it is for SQL. SQL behaves differently based upon the fact that it's a relational database and the way we store information is a bit different. So with that being said, let's open up our matchup model. I'm going to actually make a new vertical tab group. I'll unpin this. And now we can see the information we need to store. Well, let's create our layout of what it's going to look like. ID equals 0. That's the first position. Next, we're going to have a entries equals 1. And that will be pipe delimited, because we'll have more than one entry ID. We'll say by ID. And then we're going to have a winner equals 2 and matchup round equals 3. So these are the entries we need to grab. So we have this new matchup model. We can actually change the sizing here. So we have this new matchup model. The first call is ID. That goes in the ID field for a matchup model. That's cool. Next, we have the entries. Let's worry about that in a minute. So we won't worry about grabbing that yet. Next, we're going to have the winner. And the winner is, according to this, call to, and that's a team model. And so we'll have to do something with that first in order to convert it from an ID over to a team model. And next we have the matchup round. Matchup round equals int.parse, and it is column number 3. We don't have the column number 4, which is actually the 5th column. So we have 2 values we need to worry about. We have entries and we have winner. Entries is a list of entries. So we have to load that from somewhere. And we're starting to have some moving parts here that kind of make our lives a little bit more difficult. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a private static, and let's return a list of matchup model, entry model. And we'll call this convert string to matchup entry models, string input. That's probably not enough, and it's an awful long name, but that's okay. I don't like abbreviations. So let's call that, and we'll pass in our string, and it's probably not enough. And right now we're going to do a throw new not implemented exception, which allows us to not have an error here, but at the same time it will throw an error if we try to call it. So that way we can get on to compiling this to make sure the rest compiles while still not having tackled that quite yet. And yet you won't miss it. So that's fine for now. So in theory what happens is we pass in our string and get back 1 or 2, probably, matchup entry models. And that will be a lookup from the text file. This next one's a bit easier. So we'll actually go ahead and implement this. We're going to say private static team model lookup team by ID, int ID. Now we'll call this, and let's just first put that not implement exception in just for now. And we're going to call this right here. And so what this does is it passes in, and let's convert that, so int.parse. It's going to pass in the ID, this is winner returns, it's going to store in the text file an ID. We want to rehydrate that with a full team model. So we'll convert the ID to an integer. We'll pass it into this method. This method's job will be to look up that team by ID and return the actual team. Now you may say, that doesn't sound easy. Well, we've already got the code for this. We just need to go find it. So let's come back over here and see how we do a get all teams. Well, we just do this code right here. Team file. So we need to know the team file. Pass in the full file path. Load the file. Convert to team model, passing in the people file. Therefore, we can do a same call over here. We can say list of team model teams equals call that lookup, and that should give us all of our teams. Now it's yelling at us because we don't have the team file or the people file. we need to pass those in. So this down here doesn't know what the team file or people file either. And it's at this point you should be saying, this is ridiculous. We're passing all of these file names in all over the place, and they're constants. And we're actually making them not constant anymore. What should we do? Well, we should go look at this global config. I'm actually going to move this over here to my right-hand side. In global config, we have configuration information. That would seem like a great place to put all of this constant information. So if I were to cut it from here, that'd be a problem, because I'd have to refactor everywhere to say global config dot prizes file. So I'm going to copy that and paste it in. And instead of private, I'll make each of these public. So now global config dot prizes file, and we can get the value. So with that being said, we can come back over here. We can forget about passing in the team file, the people file. It's going to yell at us again. Let's give us a little more space here. We can say global config dot team file dot full file path and all the rest. And then global config dot people file. Now at this point, you're probably twitching, and you should, because I now have over here in my global config, I have these constants, which are the file names for all of my different files. But then also in text connector, I have that very same list. I use this for most stuff, and I use this for little stuff. That's not great, but right now it works. And right now it doesn't step on each other's toes. The problem is that they are in two different locations and they're copies of each other. Therefore, if I modify one, I have to remember to modify both. That's definitely not dry. They do not repeat yourself. So eventually I need to refactor that. Today is not that day. We got enough stuff to do. But eventually I'll go through and refactor, and one of the things I'll do is I'll rip out everywhere that I use these, and I'll point them instead to use these instead. So now I have this team model lookup at least getting all of the teams. Now I can say return teams.where x equal greater than x dot id equals id, not is, id dot first. And now we're returning, we can get rid of the exception throw. Now we're returning the first team where the ID matches the passed in ID. Will this blow up if you don't have a valid ID? Absolutely. You should never pass in an invalid ID. If you do, something's gone horribly wrong. Therefore, we want it to blow up. So let's just keep that in mind. So, team lookup by ID, that's complete. So we're done here. Now we need to do this convert string to matchup entry model. In essence, it's the same pattern, only we do that split first and then get each ID. So we're going to say string array. We'll call this IDs equals input.split on the char, and the char here is pipe. Remember that entries is pipe delimited by ID. So now in theory, we have a list of IDs where those are the matchup entries for this matchup. So now we want a list of matchup entry model called output. Create a new list for that. And then next what we're going to do is we're going to say for each string ID in IDs. And we'll do the same thing we did right down here. So we'll say output.add, and we need to have that list. So I'm going to comment that out for a minute. First, we need to load the list of our, instead of teams, our matchup entries. So list of matchup entry model entries equals, and this is where we do global config dot, and this is the matchup entry file dot full file path dot load file. So far so good. We have all this stuff. Dot convert to matchup entry models. We don't have that one. And that's okay, because we're going to create it. But let's pretend for a minute we have it. Now, what we'd say is output.add entries where x equals greater than x.id double equals int.parse id. And we're going to say at the end of that, dot first. So to the first match on the ID from our entries list. So we're going to look up entries, which is all the entries we have. We're going to find the one that has the matching ID. We're going to add that to output. We're going to loop through the next ID if there is another ID. The final thing is return output. So this method is done, except for we have to create this extension method. Now let's create that extension method. And it's going to be a public static list of matchup entry model. There's the name. This list of string input, and that's all we need. We can do a return. Let's do a throw new not implemented exception. Just for now, just to make sure everything else looks like it's going to compile. I don't see any other red squigglies. So now let's find the pattern for this convert. So let's find another convert in here. Let's get a simpler one. Let's do a convert to person model. That sounds like it's a reasonable one. And I'm going to paste the code in here. And I'll use this as a pattern. So I'm going to comment it out for now. Because the important thing is just to see the pattern and how it works. So I'll actually start up top. And I'll say list of matchup entry model output equals new list of matchup entry model. And we're going to do a for each string line in lines. And what is lines? That's actually our input. Okay, so now we're going to say split this up by columns. Split on the comma. And this is a simple lookup. This is just reading from our matchup entry model. So let's pull our matchup entry model up. And we'll put it over on the right-hand side. And we're going to do a couple of things here. So we have our ID first. So let's actually create our information up here. So we have our ID equals column 0, the team competing equals column 1, the score equals column 2, and the parent matchup equals column 3. So now down here, just following the pattern we have down here, we're going to say matchup entry model, call it M equals new matchup entry model. Let's call it ME to be consistent. We called it that before. ME dot ID equals int dot parse calls 0. That's our ID. Next, we have ME dot team competing. What's the team competing? Well, that's going to be calls 1, but that's going to be the ID of a team competing, not the actual full model. How do we get the full model? Well, it feels like we've done this before. In fact, if we look down, we'll see that we've done this recently. I always forget where in my code I did it. I believe it's actually down here. Let's keep going down. And we'll find lookup team by ID. So I'll copy that whole entry. And I'll scroll back up to where we're working. And say team competing equals lookup by ID, but not call 2, it's call 1. That's the column for team competing. So that was actually pretty simple. Me.score, and score is an integer. Nope, it's a double. So therefore we say double.parse calls 2. And now finally we have me.parent matchup equals, and we can't do call 3. We have to have something. And we'll just keep tugging on this thread. So we're going to say lookup. We're going to follow the same pattern, lookup team by ID. We're going to look up matchup by ID. Int.parse, this will be an ID, calls 3. So we're going to pattern the lookup team by ID. We're going to pattern that for looking up a matchup model. So let's find lookup team by ID. Let's create one right below it called private static. And this will be a matchup model. Lookup matchup by ID, int ID. And then we're going to say, first thing we're going to do is get a list of matchup model. We're going to say matchups equals global config dot matchup file dot full file path dot load file dot convert to matchup models. And from there, we're going to say return matchups dot where x equal greater than x dot id double equals id dot first. Following the exact same patterns up here, we're just going to call this convert to matchup models. And from that, we can get all the matchup models, and from that, we can get the specific matchup model we need from the text file and get that ID and rehydrate the entire item. Now you may notice this is a little bit circular because we are working up here. Let's find it. We're working up here in the convert to matchup entry models. Where does that get called? If you mouse over, you see the one reference right here? It's kind of small. This tells us how many places this method is called. We can click on it, and it shows us, well, it's on line 238 of, well, this file. So we scroll down, we see line 238, that's where we call it. Convert to matchup entries file. And so you start going backwards, you'll find that we're calling each of these methods back and forth a little bit, and that's okay, because we're calling the matchup entry model, and then we're calling the matchup model, we're calling matchup entry model back and forth, as long as it's not totally circular, where we have this problem where one relies on the other and the other relies on the first one to the point where they're both trying to get pieces of information that kind of locks up. As long as that doesn't happen, we're fine. But what we're looking up here is the parent. Well, as long as we store things in the right order, we'll have saved the parent model by the time we need to get it for a matchup entry model. Because the first round has no parent. It's only the second round and beyond that has parent ID. And so at that point, we'll need the parent ID, but those will already be stored in the database. So yeah, it can be a little bit confusing, especially always looping back and forth. And sometimes it's hard to visualize what all these different methods do. My encouragement to you is to step through it manually by pretending like you're running a file through it and see what happens. So now we have this lookup matchup by ID and put that in the parent matchup. There's one problem with that though. So let's go down and look up the matchup by ID. Here we said just grab the first where the ID matches. Well, what happens if the ID isn't there? Well, it blows up. And normally, for example, the team, look up team by ID, we have to have the team there. But remember that the parent may be null. And so if the parent is null, that's the first round people, they don't have a parent matchup. If that's null, then that would be an empty ID. Therefore, we couldn't parse it. Up here, we couldn't do an int.parse. That would blow up. Even if we got it to somehow pass the information through, we wouldn't find that team in the list. So .first would also blow up. So this is kind of a problem. So what we do is we fix this by saying we need to change how this is processed. Let's do this. If int.parse calls 3, and let's do try parse. If int.tryParse calls 3, we're going to say out, and here's where we have to give it a value. So bear with me here, and I'll explain in a minute. Int, and this would be the parent ID equals 0, and we'll pass that as the output parameter. If it's true, then do this. Else, we're going to say me.parentMatchup equals null. So let's take a step back and look what's happening. The very first thing I do is I create this ID that will hold the parent ID. That's an actual integer. Next, I do an if statement. And I say if int.tryParse. Well, tryParse tries to parse the value. If it succeeds, it says yay and returns true. If it fails, it says aw and returns false. So therefore, if it succeeds, it's a valid ID. Therefore, we don't have to do all this parse here. We can just say parent ID. If it succeeds, then it will send the value back out through the parent ID. And we've done int.tryParse before, so I'm not going to go over it and over it. But now this parent ID will have a valid value of an ID. Therefore, we can do a lookup. But if it's an invalid value, or the tryParse fails, essentially, which an empty string will fail a tryParse. If it fails, put a null in parent matchup, which is exactly what we want. So now that should do the trick. So looking at our pattern, we've got the create the output list. We've done a for each, except for the output.add. So at the end of the for each, we say output.add me, or ME, which stands for matchup entry. So we add that to the output, and then after the for each, we return output. That's right there. So we don't need our model anymore. And now this right here converts to matchup entry model. So now that works for the entries. And now we can say grab the entry where it matches. So probably by this point you've lost the thread of where we're at. So here's what I do. I minimize or shrink down the methods that are done. And this one right here appears to be done as well. This converts a string to matchup entry model. And that was what was calling the convert to matchup entry models that I needed. Therefore, I can look on the reference here and see where was that called, line 270. I can click on that, or double click on it, and go right to it, which is right there. And now I'm back to where I need to be, which is convert to matchup model. So I'm looking at the convert to matchup model, and I see that, yep, that looks like it's right. And that's called right here, lookup matchup by ID. That's called up here. And so now I'm in that loop there, and I want to make sure that I get out of that loop, at least in the code. And so I'll take a step back by, again, shrinking these down and start to do a little bit of investigation of where is the next step I need to take in this process. And right here, I see I have this save matchup to file, and then save entry to file, which is also blank. So I have a section right here where I'm saving a matchup, and then I need to save the entries. Well, I created the convert to matchup model. So the first thing I need to do, if I follow a pattern, which is over here, let's just grab this pattern. This one works. I can grab this pattern right here and comment it out. I can say list of matchup model, let's call it matchups, equals global config dot matchup file dot full file path dot load file dot convert to matchup models. We just finished all that. So now I've just loaded all the matchup models, and now I can do my check for what the maximum ID is. I can come back over here and grab this code because I know that this code works. And I'll just paste it in. I can get rid of this other code up here. That was just a pattern. So again, I'm going to follow the pattern here. In this case, I'm going to just override the values. So current ID is 1. If matchup.count is greater than 0, the current ID is now matchups.order by descending by ID. Grab the first one, take its ID, and add 1. And now we can say the matchup we passed in .id is the current ID. And now we have that ID populated for our matchup. Now we need to save each entry in our list down here. So again, we're going to follow this pattern up here. So list of matchup entry model. We're going to call this entries equals global config dot matchup entry file dot full file path dot load file. Isn't it great calling methods that we've called over and over and over again? They just do their job and it just, you don't think about it. That's one of the great things about code reuse. All right, anyways, convert to matchup entries model. Now we can say, same patterns up here, int current ID equals 1 if, and this is the entries dot count is greater than 0, current ID equals entries dot order by descending, x equals greater than x dot id dot first dot id plus 1. And now I can say that the entry dot id equals the current ID. Now you may have noticed we haven't actually saved this matchup back to the file, and we haven't saved this entry back to the file yet. And there's an ordering thing we have to get around here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to save the file here. And then after we do the for each, then we're going to save the matchup file. And the reason we do it in that order is because the matchup is the one that has the list of matchup entries. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pipe delimit that by their ID. So therefore we have to do it in this order, saving this one first, so we have the ID for each of them, and then come back and save the file up here so we have those IDs for saving. Just like we'll need to save the information about the rounds before we save the tournament file. So let's figure out how to save this information. And this again is where we look for our patterns. So you come up here and look for, let's look at this one. This one looks good. We'll grab this pattern. And then we'll come down here to where we need to save first our save entry to file. And we'll look at actually saving our entry. And so this is our pattern. So we'll comment this out. And we're going to say, okay, we need a list of string. And we call this lines equals new list of string. That works. And now we're going to do a for each on our matchup entry model entry in entries. And that won't work because we already have an entry, so we'll call this just E. And we also have to remember before we do this to say entries.add entry. Don't forget to add the newest entry to our list. But we'll loop through every entry, and we're going to say lines.add. We'll use a $sign syntax. We'll complete our whole line before we come back and put information inside the double quotes. And this is where we have to follow our pattern. So what is our pattern? Well, if we come up here, we'll find our convert to matchup entry model. And there's our pattern. So let's grab that. And then now down here, we can follow the same pattern in reverse. So the very first item we put in here is going to be e.id, comma, no space. Then we have e.teamcompeting.id. Don't forget it's just the ID, not the whole team. Comma, no space, e.score, comma, oops, no space, e.parentmatchup.id. Now, what if parent matchup is null? And that's where you actually need to add some code before this lines.add. So we're going to say string parent equals empty string. We're going to say if e.parentMatchup is not equal to null, then parent equals e.parentMatchup.id. And you can't just put a int into a string. So you have to say .toString. So now you can use this parent in place of e.parentMatchup.id. And it will either be an empty string, nothing there, or it will be that ID. So that's perfect, and that will work for every loop through. That's great. And that's our pattern. 0 is ID, got it. 1 is team competing's ID, got it. And team competing should never be null. And 2 is score, got it. And 3 is that parent matchup ID, or blank. We've got that as well. So we followed our pattern. And now our pattern says outside the for each, we're going to say file.write all lines. We're going to pass in the file name.fullPath. Well, what's the file name? Global config dot matchup entry file dot full file path, comma, lines. So we followed a pattern to the T, and now we have stored our entry model. And since we're going to call this either once or twice, depending on the matchup, we'll have stored either 1 or 2 entries in, each one being sure we get the ID for it. And now we can actually save our matchup. So we'll follow the same pattern as down here. So I'll just move so I can see both. I'm going to say list of string lines equals new list of string. I'm going to say for each, this will be matchup entry. I'm sorry, matchup model. We'll call it M. In, and our list is going to be matchups. In matchups. There we go. I spell it right. So for each matchup in matchups, we want to do this right here. So we'll ignore this for now. We got to figure out if we actually need it first. But let's find our pattern for the matchup. So we need to have the save to matchup file. Let's find that. Okay, so we can expand this out. And here is our pattern we have to follow. So coming down here, let's go ahead and paste our pattern in. And now we're going to say lines.add $, 2 double quotes, finish our line off with a semicolon, come back, and the first one is m.id, comma, no space, then it's m dot, that's going to be entries. The problem is that we have more than one entry potentially, and we have to convert these to a pipe delimited list. So how do we do that? Well, we've done this before, so let's find out where we did. In fact, we can come down here and see convert round list to string, convert matchup list to string, convert prize list to string. So let's just grab one of these. Let's convert convert prize list. And you know what? We'll actually just paste this. And instead of convert prize list, we're going to say convert, and this will be matchup entry list to string. Call it entries. I'll rename prize to entries, which will rename all of these. So it says if the count is 0, return nothing. For each entry, we'll call it E instead of P. I'll do the control dot there as well to rename it. And then we're going to loop through every matchup entry model in our entries, grab the ID, pipe delimit it, take the substring at the end to take off the last pipe, return the output. So it's stuff we've already done before a number of times. We'll come back up here to where we're working. And we have this m.entries, and that's not right. We have to pass in our list of matchup entry model. And we should get back our list of string pipe delimited. So now we can move on to no space, m.winner. And here's the problem. We need the winner ID, but the winner is most likely going to be null at first. So we'll follow the same pattern that we did before right down here. I'm going to copy this. And I'll paste it up here and change all the information. So winner, if m dot, not parent matchup, but winner, get rid of that. If m dot winner is not equal to null, then winner equals m dot winner, not whiner, winner dot id dot toString. So it's the same pattern there. We're just going to grab, if it's null, then we revert back to our empty string. But if it's not null, then we grab the ID. So that's the winner. And then finally, we have to pass in the matchup round. No space here. M dot matchup round. And now we have our line to save to the database, or to the file, I'm sorry. And now after we have our line added, we just call this line right down here and just change the file name. So instead of matchup entry file, we're going to say it's the matchup file, because we're in the save matchup file. So we will save that matchup file, and now this is done. We've saved the matchup file to the database. And so now we can look at the reference for this, go where it's called, and see that our goal here for save rounds to file was to loop through each round, go through each matchup, get the ID, which we've done that. We've gone through the round, the matchup, grab the ID for the matchup, and save the record. And then inside of here, we then loop through every entry, got the ID, and saved it. So we've done all of that. So now this is complete. We can go where it's been called from, model.saveRounds to file. And so now all the rounds have been saved. And so now we do a tournaments.add the model and save to tournaments file. We can feel comfortable knowing that's been actually saved to the database properly, and it will save all the information to the database. Now the only thing left to do before we test this is we have a to-do that's still outstanding. Capture round information. If we go there, we see that in the text connector processor, we have this convert to tournament models. This is where we're rehydrating from a text file our current tournament models that are available. And we load everything except the round information. So now we need to load the round information. So how do we do that? Well, we've got most of the code already, so it's not going to be nearly as hard as you'd probably think it would be. So what we've done is we first have to capture all of the round information, which is actually the matchup information. If we scroll down here, and sometimes if you want to mark your place somewhere, just put a breakpoint. It's easy to find that breakpoint in the list and come back to it. See that little dot over there? You can see that, the dot right there. And if you put my cursor somewhere else, it's easier to see. To go there, I just move my bar up and you'll actually see it. So that's where we're going to put information. But let's go down and find out where we're loading matchup information. Because remember that the way this is stored, the rounds are stored by matchup model. Each of these IDs represents one matchup model. So this is actually going to be pretty simple because down here we have a lookup for matchup models. List of matchup model right here. And it grabs all the matchup models that have been saved in our text files. So therefore, we can come up here to our lists and paste that in. So now we have all of our matchups. So now we can say string array, and we'll call this rounds equals calls, I believe it's calls 5, but let's check to be sure. Calls 5 is rounds, correct. So calls 5 dot split, and we're going to split on the pipe character first. And so what that will do is it will give us, let's look at our example here. It'll give us this chunk, it'll split on this, and then it'll give us this chunk and this chunk. So that's our list of matchups. So therefore, what we need to do is do a for each. We're going to say string round in rounds. So it's going to loop through every string here. We're going to do a string array. We're going to say matchups equals round dot split, and the character we're going to split on is the caret. And it looks like we already have matchups up here, so we can't use matchups. Let's just use MS, and that works for now. So up here, notice we have, remember I said that this was one chunk? Well, if we split this chunk by that caret symbol, then we'll have an array of IDs. So now we have the array of IDs. We can add to our tournament model, TM, dot rounds. And this is going to be a first round, so we'll actually have to create a list for this. So let's create a list of, in this case, a list of matchup matchup model. And we're going to have to call this, let's call this MS, which I know we have a name conflict there. So we'll say that this is MS text. All right, so what we have here is, let's get rid of this for a minute. So what we have here is we've got our list of matchup model. Let's ignore it for now. Let's get back to that in a minute. First, we split on our pipe character. That gives us an array, a string array, of chunks of data. And those chunks are these chunks right here. And then for each one of those, we split on the caret. And so now this array contains a series of IDs in string format we can then use to look up our matchups. So we do a for each here. And we'll come back to why we need this matchup model. We're going to do a for each, and we're going to say string, and this is going to be the matchup model text ID. Just be very clear what that is. And we're going to say in MS text. So now we have a series of IDs that are in string format. And so we're going to say we have to add these once we do the conversion. Notice this right here. We find the ID where it matches, grab the first one, and normally we just add it right to an array, or a list, right off of the tournament model. We can't do that yet because it's a list of matchup model. Therefore, we have to add it to this matchup model right here. So we say ms.add. We're going to say that we need to grab the matchups right up here. Matchups where x equals greater than x.id equals double equals int.parse, and this is the matchup model text ID. And then after that, we're going to say dot first and a semicolon at the very end. So what that does is it finds the matchup model that matches the ID. So we've grabbed now down to this level and said find that one. Next we'll go to this one. And next we'll go to this one. When we're done these three, that's one section where they need to then take that list of matchup model and push it to rounds. So therefore, once we're done this for each, then we're going to say that TM, which is a tournament model, dot rounds dot add, not first, dot add MS. And that's our list And so actually we're going to move this and have a declaration down inside our for each, because that way it will go away when we hit this curly brace right here. It'll get recreated once we start into this curly brace up here for the next iteration. And then for every one, we'll populate that list, take the list, add it to the rounds. By the time we're done, we will return we'll have populated all of our rounds. Therefore, our to-do is now a to-done. And we can just take the to-do off, and now it says capture rounds information. And that's what it should be doing. So we've got a lot of code in here. We've got to see if it's going to work. So let's go ahead and test it. So we come over to Solution Explorer. We can repin this. Come down to program.cs. Change the database type to text file. And we should be able to run this. So let's hit F5. We'll start this. And it didn't crash, which again, that's good. So let's call this our text tourney. The entry fee is going to be 25. We have the best team, that's the only team. So let's add that team to the list and then create a couple more. We'll again do 3. So the worst team. And we'll put Bob Smith in that team, and just Bob. And then we'll create another one, and we will call it the OK team. And we will put Sue on that. We'll create that team. And we'll create a prize. Let's just do just one. We're going to call it place numbers 1, first place. And the prize amount is $100. Now we will create tournament. Before we do though, let's move this over so we have this list of our files. We only have 3 so far. We click create tournament. It blows up, and that's okay. Again, it says object reference not set to an instance of an object. I told you that'd become familiar with you. So let's close out the exception, but not pause the code or not change the code. So we're still sitting here at this line, and it's asking for parent. Parent is 1, that's cool. E.score is 0, that's cool. E.teamcompeting is null. So here again, if we look at where we are in our entries, we're going to find that this matchup entry is ID number 4. And so we've already gone through. Notice the ID for the matchup round for the parent is 1. And so we've already gone through this once, and now we're in the second round. And so there is no team competing. We forgot to make that modification. So let's do that right now in line. We'll say string, because we can do a string. This is a string right here. So string, we'll call this team competing equals empty string. If e.teamcompeting is not equal to null, then team competing equals e.teamcompeting.id.toString. And so that's the same logic as before. And now we'll just move our place up to this line right here and hit continue. And it's going to say, whoa, whoa, whoa. Nope, can't do that because we never changed this line right here. So let's go back up to here and change this to use just that string variable instead of directly calling it. And now I can run it again, and we get a different error. Input string was not in the correct format. Okay, let's figure out why. So, calls, we can hopefully get rid of that error pop it up. There we go. Notice that calls for position 1 is an empty string, which is okay. Look up team by ID for team competing. That's going to be null. So let's move back up 1. We're going to step into the code. We're going to go into lookup team by ID. And it goes, nope, can't do that. Here's why. We're doing int.parse here. So lookup team by ID, that's not going to work because we're not passing in a valid integer. And so what we need to do is we need to kind of bypass this line. We need to say if int, let's not do int, calls 1.length equals 0. What's calls length right now? 0. Why do we know that? Well, calls, it's either a number or it's an empty string. Therefore, if the length equals 0, then me.teamCompeting equals null. Else, and this is where we put this code. So I'm actually going to move my cursor up right now, or my process line, whatever you want to call that. And then I will move that line inside my else statement. And now, if I run this, we should see that team competing becomes null, and we can continue on. And we get another sequence contain no elements error. So that's a little bit different than before, but let's figure out why. We're looking up matchup by ID. What's the ID? 1. We have matchups right now has 0 in it. Now this is an interesting one because when I look up the matchup ID, I see that this says that the value is 1. But when I look up the value for the matchups, I see I have 0 matchups from my matchup file. And if I actually open up the file itself, I will confirm that yes, that's true. So this is one of those things where, remember I said before we had a circular issue and it should be okay? It looks like it's not. So how do we diagnose this? Well, the first thing I want to do is I want to find out where this was called. So I'm actually going to move my line up 1. So my yellow indicator of where I am. And then I'm going to put in some code that will let us return out of this method, and it's really invalid. Okay, return null. So I'm going to have to come back through in this text connector processor, line 279, and delete that code. So I have to remember to do that. I'm going to move my cursor down to that. And I'm going to say step into. Go to the next line and see that I am in the convert to matchup entries model. Now remember that we have to do this convert to matchup entries model when we're saving to the file for the matchup entries. So this is the loop part that we've got an issue on, where I'm trying to do a lookup and I'm saying give me the matchup ID of 1, but it's not saved yet. Because if we look at the ordering, and that ordering is in here somewhere, and let's find that. And here I found it. We have the save matchup to file. We come through and we create the matchup and get the matchup ID. And we say save entry to file down here for a matchup entry, which actually saves the file. And then we come back up here and save our matchup to file because we needed those IDs for the matchup entries. So we've got an ID that we passed in here and said this is our ID for a matchup, but we don't actually have it saved to the file yet. So that's a little bit of a circular issue here where we need the ID in order to continue, and we need to continue before we put the ID in. And so I'm actually going to stop right now. I'm going to stop this code, take out my junk code, which is just return null, and then address this issue here. So I need to save this matchup to my file before I save my matchup entries. But then I'll need to update that again once I have my matchup entries saved. So let's just do that. Let's save it twice. Now this code can probably use a refactor, but at this point I'm trying to debug and make sure it works. Working code is much, much better than refactored code that still has a bug in it. So right now I have all this code writes to my text file. Well, what if I did this? I copied it and I pasted it before I have my matchup entries, and then I also need to take away the declaration for the lines right here. So if I do this, the only issue that I see right now is that when I loop through and I try and add my entries, that's going to be an issue. And so I have my ID and I have convert matchup entry list to string. Well, right now there is nothing in that list. Therefore, I really could say empty string. And I could probably get away with that. I think I can. So if I can get away with that, then I'll be good. I'll save this entry. It'll be in the file. And then I'll come back through and add the matchup entries. And then afterwards, I'll do the exact same save again. Only this time, I'm going to save it with the correct IDs. So that's one theoretical way of saving that or fixing that issue. But, looking at this, I'm going to undo all of this. And let's just redo that. I'm going to undo all this and look at it again and just look at my pattern here. And the one thing I'm noticing in my pattern is that I have my matchups list, which converts all the current matchups over into my matchup entry here. But what I don't have is anywhere that I'm adding this matchup to my list of matchups. And that's kind of a problem. So let's do this. Matchups dot add matchup. Now I add that before I did my entry model, but that's okay because again, the whole idea of address, each of them has an address at the same location. So if I modify my entry models, not a big deal. So with this fix, I know that was a problem. And what I'm saying is I thought that I had the loops taken care of. So let's see if the small fix that I know is a problem fixes the issue, or if I have a larger fix as well. So we've got an idea for a larger fix, but let's start with a smaller fix and see if this works. So let's call this tournament something different. In fact, let's call it something different. That way we know that it's different than the previous one that may have been partially created. The best team, the worst team, and the okay team. So 3 teams. We'll create a prize. We'll create the prize for first place, and we'll call it the only place. And the prize amount is, let's say 150 this time. And we'll say create tournament. And we get this sequence contains no elements. So we still have this issue of matchups being 0. Which means that this right here didn't solve our problem. So let's again take this logic right here, and we're going to copy it. We're going to paste it up here. And we'll again change this so it's not being redeclared, but reinstantiated. And now we have two saves, one before and one after. Now you might think, wait a minute, am I going to have, duplicate matchups or something like that? And the answer is no, because we only load the list of matchups once, and we add the new matchup, and then we save it, overwriting the file, and then we save it again, overwriting the same file. So it should be that we're good there. And we'll try this empty string here. Notice that even though the curly braces are here, this empty string still works. And so that's just kind of a benefit, because I can leave those curly braces there saying, yes, this is an entry. And so 0, 1, 2, 3 is easier to count than 0. Oh, that string right there is 1. There's that duplicate comma isn't a mistake. There's actually a column there. So that's just something quick and simple. So this is a kind of a hacky solution right now, but we can refactor this to make it better. But first, let's see if it works. We'll call this tournament, does it work? And the entry fee is only $5. And we're going to add all 3 teams. We'll create a prize. This prize is for place number 1. Best for first place. And the prize amount is only $15. And we'll create the tournament. Now, nothing seemed to happen yet. All right, we have a Stack Overflow exception. That's not usually good. Stack Overflow means we have a problem loading something. Let's look at what we're trying to load. All right, we're trying to load the personmodels.csv. So let's look at our file, personmodels.csv. There we go, it's 1 kilobyte. That's not a big deal. If we open this with Notepad, we'll see we have Joe Smith, Sue Storm, and Bob Smith. That's fine. So if we read all lines of this, what should be the problem? Well, I don't know. And it seems to have crashed. So let's first of all look at our files for matchup model. Again, don't panic. Matchup model has 1 entry. Matchup entry model has 4 entries. So we got something going on here. And now let's look. We don't have a tournament model yet. We haven't gotten that far. So let's start again and just run it again and see if we can reproduce that bug. Buggy. Entry fee is $5. We're going to add all 3 teams. We'll create a prize. We'll do it for place number 2, bug place, and the prize amount is 10. And we'll say create tournament again and see if we get that same error. And we do. An unhandled exception of type system.stackoverflow has occurred. Make sure you do not have an infinite loop or infinite recursion. So that's interesting. We've got possibly an infinite loop on the loading the team models. So that's the place we need to debug. Now it's at this point that I've got 2 suggestions. Number 1 is that when you get to this point where you've written a lot of code and you get these weird errors you can't quite figure out why, before you just start hacking stuff together, which we've already started a little bit with that one hack, which we thought would work, and I'm not sure why it's not, but instead of continuing to throw more code at it, stop. Pause, take a break, take a walk, take a shower, go to sleep. what that will do is it will refresh your brain, and you'll be able to come at this problem in a little different angle than you would right now. And the other thing is, especially for this video, we're getting kind of long, and I don't want to have this video be a series into itself. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to dedicate a video specifically to debugging. And we're going to figure out how to debug these weird kind of errors where it's kind of hard to figure out what's going on, because if I hit, step into, it immediately stops. So how do I know what the recursion is? Why the Stack Overflow exception, which seems kind of like an infinite loop, is it probably a possibility, but where is that loop? And so we're going to stop at this point. We're going to have a video dedicated just to debugging, which will be really instructional, because it'll walk you through that process. Because here's the deal. This happens in every application. So far, we have been incredibly fortunate in that we have followed our plan. Our plan has mostly worked, and we've had very, very few errors. But as you get into these really long, complex applications or sections of your application where you're creating, method after method after method, that can get kind of hard to track back with where you were and keep track of all the different steps and where you left off. And we already saw that. We've already done that, where I wasn't quite sure where to go back to, and I had to use the references to go back to it. And so it's at that point that you can introduce more bugs. And so we're going to take a break for now. We're going to do a debug next and show you how to identify where this bug is and how to really crush it. All right. So definitely stay tuned for that so we can get our application back up and running. And then once we're done debugging, we'll move on to creating those other two forms